So this is the beginning of the back and forth conversation that happens between Job and his friends. Job has already spoken in chapter 3, but now Eliphaz, after giving Job his opportunity to speak, speaks up. And we need to remember what is said at the end of this book. In Job 42 and verse 7, that the friends do not say what's right about God like Job does. And so we already can view it through that prism as we go through this book and this conversation back and forth, that what Job says about God is acceptable to God, and what the friends say about God is not acceptable to God. And so we know who's right and who's wrong as we read through this conversation. And so Eliphaz begins in chapter 4 in verses 1 through 6. He has some encouraging words for Job. He talks about how Job has strengthened the weak hands. He has been with those who have had calamity come into their life. And I think as we read through this, there is an implication as well that Job also has rebuked those who have sinned and are suffering the consequences of their sin as well. Because that's sort of the idea that Eliphaz has about Job, that it's now his turn to rebuke Job for his sin. In verses 7 through 11, we have Eliphaz's premise about these things. And that is that all suffering is the result of sin. That God, if you are suffering, that is God punishing you for some specific sin that you have committed. And he uses a correct principle, but then he misapplies that principle. He basically has the idea of you reap what you sow. And that principle is found throughout the Bible, that we reap what we sow. We reap the natural consequences of sin in this life. Sometimes we reap the punishment from God because of our sin in this life, and if not, we certainly will in eternity. You reap what you sow. So if you are reaping suffering, that's what you have sown. It is a punishment from God. And so he asked the question in verse 7, "Remember, I pray thee, who ever perished being innocent? Or where were the righteous cut off? Even as I have seen, they that plow iniquity and sow wickedness reap the same." And so he's saying, Job, you are reaping what you have sown. Now, this is going to be a theme throughout the book, that they're going to accuse Job of sin, but they can't actually name what his sin is. They don't have a list of sins that he has committed. Now, they're going to offer a hypothetical list. Well, maybe you've done this, or maybe you've done that, or this other thing. But they don't have a specific thing that they can pin on Job and say, you've done this, and so God is punishing you for it. He next moves on to this different idea in verses 12 through 21 of chapter 4, and that is this vision that he had. He talks about how a thing was secretly brought to him, and he heard a little bit of it. When he's going to sleep at night, the thoughts of the visions of the night came to him, made him tremble, made the hair on his flesh stand up, and it said this vision stood still, but I could not discern the form thereof. An image was before mine eyes. There was silence, and I heard a voice saying, "Shall mortal man be more just than God? Shall a man be more pure than his maker?" And we asked the question last week about, well, did he actually see a vision or not? And I think we can safely assume that he didn't, because of how this thing comes about and how God actually speaks to people. In 1 Timothy 4:1, the Spirit speaketh expressly. So even in the times when God directly inspired people, he spoke clearly. He's not going to tell you a message and you're going to get just a little bit of it. But still, this question, this rhetorical question in verse 17, is a valid point in general. shall mortal man be more just than God? Shall a man be more pure than his maker? And of course not. But they're misapplying that idea to Job. That, Job somehow thinks that he is more just than God, and so God is not right for punishing him this way. And so he says, behold, he put no trust in his servants, and his angels he charged with folly. And so he's even hard on the angels. Who are you to question God doing these things to you, Job? And so they misapply this as well to Job. And then we come down to chapter 5 and Eliphaz's next point. He basically asked Job to ask someone for help. He says, call now if there be any that will answer thee, and to which of the saints wilt thou turn? Where are you going to turn, Job? You can't turn to God. You've left him. You think anybody else on God's side is going to join forces with you? He goes on, for wrath killeth the foolish man, and envy slayeth the silly one. And so, you're not going to be able to get anybody who's on God's side to stand with you on this. It's an awful approach that he's taking toward his friend Job here. Assuming that Job is not on God's side, that he has sinned so grievously against God that God has turned his back on him and is punishing him for these things, and so that now he can't be on his side either. But notice how Eliphaz continues in verses 3 through 5. I have seen the foolish taking root, but suddenly I cursed his habitation. His children are far from safety, and they are crushed in the gate, neither is there any to deliver them. Whose harvest the hungry eateth up, and taketh it even out of the thorns, and the robber swalloweth up their substance. He is now relying on his observation, what he sees in the world. Those who are foolish, those who sin, they suffer the consequences of those sins. And we have similar observations as well, that sin leads to destruction and suffering and difficulty in life. And so we've seen people's lives be ruined by sin. And, we're familiar with the concept there. But what he does, once again, just as he did with the idea of reaping what you sow, he's taking something that is generally true and misapplying it to Job's specific situation. And so this is a misapplied observation from Eliphaz, that he observes this, and so he says, well, since other suffering is a result of people's sins, yours must be as well. And, of course, we know that is false. Money doesn't grow on trees is a expression we use. And it's a similar expression to what's being said in verse 6. We say money doesn't grow on trees to say that, money doesn't just come from nowhere. You have to go out and earn money and make it, things like that. Here applied to affliction. Suffering is not a coincidence, is what Eliphaz is saying. You are suffering, it's not a coincidence. It didn't just happen without there being a root cause, and that root cause being you're so evil and you have committed so much sin. We know that all suffering is a result of the sin that happened in the Garden of Eden. That's where all suffering and death and difficulty can be traced back to. And so in that sense, all suffering is a result of sin. But not all of my suffering is a result of my specific sin. Some of it is. Sometimes you say the wrong thing to the wrong person and they punch you in the face for it, right? That's you suffering for your sin. If you spend your life drinking and you end up with liver damage, you are suffering because of your sin. There are natural consequences to these things. But not all of our suffering is a result of our specific sin. But that's his point here, is that it doesn't come from nowhere. You are being punished. It's not a coincidence. And sometimes God does that. So we also can't say that all suffering is just because of Adam and Eve's sin, in the sense that, I don't have any guilt myself for suffering. Because sometimes we suffer because we sin. Sometimes God steps in and says, you're going to be punished for this. Saul is an example of this, right? He was punished because of his specific sins. And so sometimes God does do that. But it's sort of an it depends type situation, right, while we're suffering. All of it can be traced back to Adam and Eve. That's when suffering came into the world. But sometimes I suffer because of the sins of others. Sometimes I suffer because of my own sins. It's the natural consequence of it. And sometimes God specifically punishes us for sin. And so we understand that all that happens, and so not every kind of suffering or not every event of suffering is because of my exact sin or specific sin. And so in verse 7, yet man is born unto trouble as the sparks fly upward. There are different interpretations and translations of what it means by the sparks fly upward. Some say that this is talking about birds. Either way, it's saying this is and it's most likely talking about the embers that come from a fire. They float up. That's just what they do. It's the natural order of things. And so it is with man in trouble. It seems to me that he's sort of contradicting himself or moving against his point, is that suffering does just happen. But he says in verse 6, it doesn't. It's not a coincidence. God is specifically bringing this on you. But this is common, is the basic idea of what he's saying. Man is born unto trouble. Here is an if I were you statement. I would seek unto God. As if Job isn't doing that. I would seek unto God, and unto God would I commit my cause. All right, so you need to turn back to God, and God will deliver you from all this trouble. Because he does great things and unsearchable, marvelous things without number. And how true is that? It's interesting as we look at the things that Eliphaz says, there's a lot of truth in what he says that's misapplied toward Job's situation. There's a lot of truth here. There's some untruths as well. But this is, the same thing that false doctrine does. In a lot of false doctrines, there's a lot of truth, and then some errors or misapplications attached to it. And that's what's happening with Eliphaz here. What he says here is absolutely right. You should seek unto God. You should commit your cause to him. He is capable of doing great and wonderful things. He gives rain upon the earth, sends waters upon the fields. He sets up on high those that be low, and that those which mourn may be exalted to safety. So Eliphaz says God's able to help you out here if you'll seek him, if you'll turn to him. But with the assumption that that's not what Job's doing. But it is. All right, so not only is God able to do such great things, he's also able to turn on those who are evil and punish them. So he disappoints the devices, the plans of the crafty, the mischievous, so that they cannot do do their plan. He taketh the wise in their own craft, and he's able to outsmart those who are planning wickedness against him. The counsel of the froward is carried headlong. He's able to cast down any sort of plans, advice of those who would be cross with him. They meet with darkness in the daytime, grope in the noonday as in the night. So he's able to turn the lights out on them so that they can't actually do what they want to do. And so he's able to do great things, and he's also able to punish and to destroy the evil and thwart their purposes. But he's able to save, and so he's able to work against the plans of the wicked, and now he's also able to help the poor and the downtrodden. He saves the poor from the sword, from their mouth, from the hand of the mighty. And so he's able to deliver them and give the poor hope. And says, and iniquity stoppeth her mouth. So that iniquity doesn't speak against the poor, basically. All right, in verses 17 through 27, Eliphaz is going to conclude, and he's also going to use a great truth that's found throughout the Bible to misapply towards Job. Again, this is a principle found throughout the Bible, that God chastens his people through suffering. All right, so in Hebrews, we're told something very simple, similar to this, to despise not the chastening of the Lord, and how it is not pleasant for the present time, but it works something good in our life. Jesus told the church at Laodicea that whom he loves, he rebukes and chastens. So they should repent and turn back to Christ. And so Eliphaz speaks an eternal truth of God here, that happy is the man that God chastens. What he says here is absolutely right. However, what's happening to Job is not God chastening him for his sin. That's not what's going on. And of course, Eliphaz doesn't understand that. Eliphaz, just like Job, didn't see Satan go before God and all this unfold behind the scenes. He only has what his false assumptions are about suffering, that it's all because of sin, or, specific sin. And so God must be chastening him, but he's not. That's not what's happening with Job. So he's misapplying this eternal truth of God. So if you'll just accept the chastening of the Lord and turn your wicked life around, Job, God will deliver you out of all kinds of troubles. And so he says 6, yea, 7, which was an old way of talking about completeness. When they would give a number and then they would add one to it, it was to emphasize their point. And we see that same sort of literary device being used in Proverbs and some of the prophets as well. And he does it here. So in 7, there shall no evil touch thee. So he goes through them. Famine, he shall redeem thee from death. And war, from the power of the sword, you'll be delivered from that. You'll shalt be hid from the scourge of the tongue. It's interesting that that's third on the list. What things that are being said about you or to you, and it's interesting that they're turning their tongues into scourges against Job here. He goes on, neither shalt thou be afraid of destruction when it cometh. At destruction and famine thou shalt laugh, neither shalt thou be afraid of the beast of the earth. And so all these different things, won't touch you. And so once again, we see his false assumption. It's the same type of assumption that people make today with the prosperity gospel. That if you're faithful to God, everything's going to be great in your life, and you're not going to be touched or hurt by any of these things that happen to others. And those things only happen to others because they are wicked and sinful. But we know that that's false. We know that there are righteous people who suffer. People who suffer not because of their own sins. And so this is the flip side of the same false assumption from Eliphaz. That if you're suffering, it's because of your sin. And if things are going well, it's because you're righteous. And that's not always the case. In fact, later on, in the Bible, we have several of the biblical authors who question this very fact that, why do the wicked prosper? Why does it seem that things go so well for those who are wicked and things are going so poorly for those who are righteous? David asked that question, and many others. And so, once again, Eliphaz is false in his assumption. You'll be in league with stones of the field, and beasts of the field shall be at peace with you. And so these natural forces won't be turned against you. God will protect you from them. You'll come home in peace, your tabernacle. You'll go to the habitation and you won't sin if you're on the right side with God. Thou shalt know also that thy seed shall be great, and so your family and it will grow, and everything will be great with your family. Thine offspring as the grass of the earth. This will be the blessing of God, that just everything will be great with your life if you'll just turn back to him and accept his chastening, repent, and ask for his forgiveness. Thou shalt come to thy grave in a full age. This statement, we don't know exactly how old Job is here, but he's not an old man. And a lot of the artwork you see about Job, he's already old when these things happen. But he's not. He would not be considered one of a full age ready to die. He was full age as in he was an adult, but he wasn't of the full age of when people normally die. And so if you'll just turn back to God, you'll go to your grave at the proper time when people usually die. Lo, this we have searched it, so it is. Trust us. We know, we have studied this out great, and we know all the details of it. We've figured all this out. You can trust us. We have searched it, so it is. Hear it, and know thou it for thy good. If you'll just listen to us and repent and turn back to God, everything will be just fine with you. It'll be for your good. But what they said wasn't right. Always got to keep that in mind.